Hi guys. Okay, so today we're going to talk about complex numbers and then we're going to learn how to add, subtract, and multiply them. So, what is a complex number? A complex number is any number that can be written in the standard form a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers and I is the imaginary unit. Remember, the imaginary unit, I, is the square root of -1. Now, A is what we call the real part because there's no imaginary part to it. There's no I. There's no square root of -1. BI is the imaginary part of the complex number. So in this table, we have examples of 1, 2, 3, 4 complex numbers. These are examples of 4 complex numbers. And we're going to look at them and find the real part and the imaginary part. So if we look at 7 plus 2i, the 7 does not have an I on it. That's the real part. The 2i, that's the imaginary part. If we look at the next one, 1 is the real part, and the -5i, you have to bring that negative with it, is the imaginary part. Now, if you look at the next one, I can see that the imaginary part is 8i. But what's the real part? What's the number that's being added that doesn't have an I? Well, if you don't see it, it's 0. There is no real part there. Now, the next one is written as a fraction. What you want to do is just like we did in all our other division problems. The first part over the denominator plus the second part over the denominator. Now it's much easier to see, oh, here's my real part, -2/5, and my imaginary part, there it is, 3/5 I or 3i over 5. It doesn't matter which way you write it. They mean the same thing. Okay? Now, let's take a look at some problems. We're going to add or subtract and express the answer in simplest a plus bi form. That's the standard form, so our answers have to be in standard form. Now, in order to do this, we combine like terms. We add the real parts to real parts. We add the imaginary parts to imaginary parts. Now, it is possible, I'm going to warn you here, it is possible that you may have to simplify the radicals first so that you can find your real and imaginary parts. So now let's look at the first problem here. 2 plus 3i plus 5 plus I. 2 is the real part of the first one, and 5 is the real part of the second one. So I'm going to add those together. 2 plus 5 is 7. Now if I look at the imaginary parts, I've got 3 plus an I. Now remember, there's a 1 there. That's the coefficient in front of that I. So 3 i's plus 1 I. 3 plus 1 is 4i. There we go. That's our first addition of complex numbers. Okay, now take a look at number 2. Number 2 is subtraction. Before we can combine like terms, we have to distribute this negative. So the first one, we don't have to worry about. It's 5 minus 3i radical 3. But now I need to do a -1 times 6, that's -6, and then a -1 times a -2i radical 3. So a negative times a negative is a positive 2i radical 3. Now we're going to take our real parts, 5 plus a -6. What's 5 minus 6? 5 minus 6 is -1. Now our imaginary parts, -3i radical 3 and a positive 2i radical 3. Notice they are like terms. They are both I radical 3's. So I know I'm going to have an I radical 3 in my answer. Well, how many do I have? I have -3 plus 2, which remember, negative 3 plus 2 is the same as 2 minus 3, whichever is easiest for you to do. 2 minus 3 is negative 1, so I don't even have to write the 1. It's just minus I radical 3. There we go. Let's try another. So again, this is a subtraction problem. So I'm going to copy the first complex number. Now I need to distribute my negative. Negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. Negative 1 times 2i is negative 2i. Now we get to combine like terms. So my real parts, 1 minus 3. 1 minus 3 is negative 2. Now the imaginary parts, 3i minus 2i. 3 minus 2 is a positive 1i. So negative 2 plus I. Remember, we don't write that invisible 1. Negative 2 plus 1i. We have to simplify that to just negative 2 plus I. Okay? Now, if we take a look at number 4, we've got radicals. So we need to simplify. This is going to be 5 plus, now I have to break this up, the square root of 36 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of 36 is 6, and the square root of negative 1 is I. Don't forget to bring down that 5 plus. Now, I have plus 3 minus, how am I going to break this one up? I know the square root of 16, I know the square root of negative 1. Bringing down my plus 3. Minus, the square root of 16 is 4, and the square root of negative 1 is I. Now we can add our like terms. My real parts, I have 5 plus 3. 5 plus 3, that's 8. My imaginary parts, I have 6i minus 4i. 6 minus 4, that's 2, and we keep the I. There we go. Now what happens if we want to multiply? So again, when we multiply, we do real parts times real. Negative 5 times 2 is negative 10. And then we do imaginary times imaginary. I times I is I squared. But remember, what is I squared? Remember your little clock here? I to the 0 is 1. I to the first is I. I squared is negative 1. And I cubed is negative I. And then it keeps going around the clock. So I squared is negative 1. Our final step, negative 10 times negative 1, we get 10. Ta-da! Last problem. Okay, we're going to distribute. So when we distribute, we have to do 2i times 5. So we do the 2 times the 5. That's 10. Keep the I. Now we're going to do 2i times negative 3i. So now 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. And the I times the I is I squared. Okay, so now I have 10i minus 6, but wait a minute, what's I squared? I squared is negative 1. So this becomes 10i, and a negative 6 times a negative 1 is a positive 6. And some of you want to stop here, but that is not correct. That is not standard form. It must be 6 plus 10i. This is the way you have to write it so that it is in standard form and you receive full credit. Okay, guys, this is where we're going to stop. Remember, a complex number has a real part, which is just a number, plus an imaginary part, which has the I, which is the square root of negative 1. When we are combining them, we combine real parts with real parts and imaginary parts with imaginary parts. Okay, guys, see you soon. Bye.